come along with me and my guest as we escape from New York.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I have an awesome interview coming right up with an accomplished filmmaker and author. But first, if you could support the podcast in some way, I would greatly appreciate it. Please like, rate, review, or subscribe to it wherever you are listening. Those things help the show out immensely, and I would greatly appreciate it, as I mentioned. Also, you can find my role-playing game resource books on DriveThruRPG, on Amazon.com, or my own website, DiceGeeks.com. I would also greatly appreciate if you check some of those resources out. They will help you cut down your Game Master prep time and have more fun at the table. But now, as I mentioned, an incredible interview. Here it is. My guest today is an award-winning filmmaker. He is a trustee of the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation. He is also the author of the new book, Escape from New York, the official story of the film that was released yesterday. John Walsh. John, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here, Matt. Thanks for having me back. I think I was your very first guest, wasn't I, in your first show?
Yes, you are the very first guest, and that was awesome to have you on. I really appreciated you coming on the show. And if my math is correct, this will be episode 117. So there's been a lot of episodes in between, but thank you so much for coming back. Thank you so much for being my first guest. That really, our conversation about Ray Harryhausen really kicked off the podcast. So I thank you so much for that.
Oh, it's all my pleasure. I'm delighted to come back and find that you're a multimillionaire podcaster influencer after so many episodes. And, this is fabulous. The bejeweled setting that we are sat in now, because isn't it amazing? You've passed 100 episodes and now the money just pours in.
Oh, yes. And yes, Spotify is calling me every day and all of that. No, still a humble podcast, but yes, I have quite a few episodes now. So I definitely appreciate you coming back on to the show and talking about your book. As listeners of the podcast know, I studied filmmaking when I was in college, and I tried independent filmmaking for a while until I almost went insane and needed food and shelter and stuff. So I love talking about movies. And when I saw that your new book was just coming out, Escape from New York, the official story of the film, I was really wanted to talk to you because Escape from New York is just kind of one of those films that kind of sticks with you. And I think you would probably agree with that you watch it and it kind of sticks with us, kind of just sticks with you after you watch it. So before we get into, some of the nuts and bolts of the book, why don't you kind of give the audience a little refresher? What is Escape from New York? When was it released? And just a kind of a sketch of the premise, if you would.
Well, this year, 2021 is the 40th anniversary for Escape from New York, which came out there in 1981. And the premise is, it seems quite straightforward now, but at the time, this was, quite revolutionary. The president of the US, played by Donald Pleasance, crashes Air Force One into New York. However, at this stage, it's the future. It's the year 1997, and New York is actually a walled prison. So the entire island of Manhattan has been walled off, and all of the bad and the terrible have been sent there by quite the right-wing government of the day in 1997. So, of course, it's kind of like a feudal colony inside. There are rules within the prison. There are no guards inside, but there are guards outside watching and ready to shoot if you try and escape. So, of course, how do you get the president out of that? Well, a newly arrested convict called Snake Plissken, who's actually a former Marine and an all-round kind of great war hero who received the Purple Heart, he is sent in And he's not asked to go in, he's ordered to go in. And he's ordered to go in, rescue the president, and bring out something he has, which is a special cassette that was needed for the Hartford Summit, which is all about nuclear weapons. So the Hartford Summit takes place within 24 hours. So here comes the dramatic device. Pliskin, you have 24 hours to get in and get out with the president. And it's like, oh, okay. And you're going to have to wear the most uncomfortable and largest digital watch known to mankind. And it's going to be so big on your wrist that you're going to be spotted from a mile away. But anyway, let's start the countdown. It's a 24-hour clock. So we're hoping that Snake has paid attention at school and he knows the time. And it counts down. And it's a great device because, of course, it sets the pace for the film. We're constantly looking at the clock, both at the police center where he's sent and also on Snake's wrist. And, of course, he loses at one stage the clock, and there's a special device to help him get out, a tracker. He loses that at some stage. And, of course, then things go really bad for Snake. So not to spoil it for people who haven't seen Escape from New York or want to refresh their memories, but go back and have a look. Because after John Carpenter made this film, people started to copy the you have 24 hours, you have 48 hours. And, the idea of setting things around the clock. You have Gordon Ramsay now sorting out a restaurant that might have been there for 20 or 30 years. But apparently there's 24 hours to save it from falling into a hole in the ground. Okay. So the dramatic device has been borrowed, nay, stolen by television and other mediums, because it's really quite intense. As that clock ticks down, you get that sense. And John Carpenter himself admitted that, it was a borrow or a steal from one of his favorite films, High Noon.
Yes. Where
we're constantly cutting to the clock and so on with Gary Cooper there. So that's the kind of the premise of the film. But of course, the film opened, it closed, years passed. And then we look back and we think, what are those pivotal films of the early 80s that we liked? Blade Runner is, of course, a film that's been bathed in praise, and despite the fact it was a critical and commercial failure at the time. Escape from New York was neither. It did well with the critics. It did great at the box office. In many ways, it was John Carpenter's last big proper success. And so we look back at it fondly. It works really well. The FX work really well. The music, the scoring, the pacing. So I brought together all of the people who were still with us for this book. And even for the people who are no longer with us, some of the great actors, I have unpublished comments, quotes, and interviews. So really, it's the definitive, as it's called, the official story of the film. I was asked by Tyson Books and Studio Canal, who are now the rights holder for this and many of the John Carpenter films, to come in and do what I did on my last book, which was Flash Gordon, the official story of the film. So going in a kind of a really deep dive making of, more than just comments from actors and more than just a few stats and a few shots. This needs to be the ultimate Bible that you return to, so that people can say, hang on, I'll check that. If it's not an official story of the film, then it's not canon, it's not a fact. So a lot of pressure in that sense that I put on myself, because I'm a big fan of this film. I remember growing up watching this on different medium, from VHS to DVD, Blu-ray, now 4K. So you want to get it right, but you need to not be a fanboy, as I found out on Flash Gordon, because sometimes actors and their stories exist within their own reality. So you need to kind of straighten it out. So it's kind of 50% making of book, 50% true crime podcast, because you're going in and straightening out the stories that have been twisted and turned for so many years that they don't make sense, or they're not true, and they've fallen into mythos. So here we are, 40 years later, a making of book finally for this film. And the surprising thing, Matt, is that no one did it before for the 30th anniversary or the 25th. Yeah. So luckily for me, they didn't.
Yeah, it is actually very surprising that nobody did a 20th or a 25th anniversary. So that is very surprising, but it was great for you that you got to sink your teeth into it. And for the 40th with not building on something somebody else had already talked about. So that's really good. That is really good. And now you did mention there are a number of things about this film that really make it powerful. And you had mentioned the countdown clock of the 24 hours. We have this deadline, and we're always like cutting back and looking at the clock. And you mentioned how good of a device that was. And there's also a couple things I've seen I've seen some people on YouTube doing like author videos and talking about writing novels, and they will talk about the Snake Plissken. Put in the Snake Plissken, and that is the idea that when other people encounter your main character, they will say something like, "I thought you were dead," or I heard you were killed in the Columbus job, or something like that. And that comes from Escape from New York. Why don't you explain to the audience what that is about in Escape from New York?
Well, yeah. So every time a snake gets to meet somebody, because they know him from reputation, you're a snake Plissken. I thought you were dead. Oh, Snake Plissken. Well, I tell who I've had in the back ring line. And it's one of those moments that it almost can take you out of the drama, and it can become quite comical. But because it's quite a dark humor, I think it works quite well. But it's often repeated to Snake. Kurt Russell himself said he based the character partly on Dirty Harry. And so that sort of cool exterior whilst everything's going on behind the eyes. But it is interesting now. It's become a shorthand for screenwriters to say, look, let's do a Snake Plissken. But it also has been for camera persons as well, the camera people. They say, let's do a John Carpenter. Let's have something very wide shot, with only maybe one character in the frame, shooting 2:3:5 to 1, which is CinemaScope or Panavision. So a lot of the language and iconography of the film has really fallen into the laps of young people who watched it at school and at college, but who are now in charge of those editorial decisions. The reason there wasn't a book 20 or 30 years ago is because those people in charge would have thought, why are you doing a book about that film? Mm-hmm. Whereas people don't think of it in that tone anymore. The same with Blade Runner that opened the following year. Great failure on every level, but now it's highly regarded, and there's books and everything else. But no, a lot of that has entered into the shorthand for filmmakers and for writers, and it must be very gratifying for John Landis, but also for John Carpenter. My apologies. It must be very gratifying for John Carpenter, but I think that's gratification is tinged with melancholy because things didn't quite work out for John the way people might have hoped or wished they had done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and why don't you tell us a little bit about John Carpenter? Of course, he was the director and co-writer of Escape from New York. Why don't you tell us a little about him and how his career got started, and then you were a little foreshadowing there as well about what kind of turned out later.
So, although somebody else helped with the writing of the final screenplay, Nick Castle, who directed the fabulous The Last Starfighter, which is an amazing film.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And I said to Nick, that needs to be a book like this.
Yes.
And I said, I want to read that book. And if I have to write it to read it, I will. But, why is that not a book?
No kidding. The Last Starfighter is incredible. Incredible film.
It's such a great film. So John Carpenter really is quite a phenomenon, really. We think of the 70s in America, and we think, of course, of great breakthrough directors like Francis Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and what George Lucas did on the Star Wars films, being a producer as well, William Friedkin. But people don't always mention John Carpenter in the same breath, and they should be, because when he kicked off with Dark Star in 1974, that initially was a film he was making at film school, I think at UCLA. And then he expanded it. No, it wasn't. It was a short he made at USC. I'm looking at my own notes now. So Dark Star started life as a student short at USC, and then it expanded into a feature-length film costing just $60,000 at the time. And it was picked up by the Los Angeles International Film Expo, and it did really quite well. And different people who worked on that picture ended up being headhunted for Star Wars. Now, John went on to direct the thriller Assault on Precinct 13, which he also wrote. Then Someone's Watching Me, which is a TV movie, which he wrote but didn't direct. And then The Eyes of Laura Mars, which was, again, a TV special. Now, his big breakthrough happened with Halloween in 1978. Mm-hmm. It was the most successful independent feature film in cinema history, bar none. So he'd really established himself with what he was doing and his style. he did the music compositions for his films. Now, often directors will bring in music and do what's called a temp track, where they'll lay music down to help them with the edit and get the mood right. Mm-hmm. Famously, Stanley Kubrick did this on 2001 and became so locked into the music, such as the Blue Danube and others, that when Alex North, the very famous composer who did Spartacus and many other things, composed the score, the full orchestral score, he wasn't aware that his music was not used until he turned up at the premiere, and it wasn't played, and he was like, "Where's my?" I imagine he said, "Where's my f-stop music?" But it wasn't to be heard or to be seen with the picture. But John Carpenter composes his own music. That is really quite unusual. There is nobody else in film history that really does that outside of student filmmakers. 1979 followed with Elvis, which was a very successful television dramatization of the life of the great Elvis Presley. And the lead was played by Kurt Russell. Now, Kurt Russell was a difficult choice at that time because the network were thinking, well, Kurt Russell is that young actor who'd been in lots of Disney films. He was a child star who'd kind of grown up. Next then was The Fog in 1980. And all of these films are stepping stones to Escape from New York. The Fog was created for Avco Embassy, which was one of the more interesting independent companies working in America, very successful. Bob Remy at Avco Embassy said to John Carpenter, look, we have to do something else together. Why don't you come and direct the Philadelphia experiment for us? Because we have that picture, you'd be great. And that's a great choice. If I was Bob Remy, I'd be thinking that's a great combination. John looked at the project and said, sure, it's fine, but I have this. And he pulled from the back of his car a script he had kicking around since the sort of mid-70s, Escape from New York. And the premise and most of the storyline was pretty much there. Nick Castle helped inject lots of humor into it and gave it some real punch in places. And so that's what happens. But John jumped from a $1 million budget from The Fog in 1980 to a $6 million budget the following year for Escape from New York. So a very big step up. Now, although that's not big budget by today's standards, or even standards at that time, previously in the previous year, Flash Gordon was shot for $35 million. And the people are always amazed by that because they think, where did all that money get spent? Yeah. So that's kind of in a nutshell where you were at that point. There was great expectation for the film's release. There was great secrecy around the film as well. So when special effects were done at a different company and so on, a different name was given to the rushes so people wouldn't look into it and see what was going on. So it was a big secret at the time what the storyline was and what the next film from John Carpenter would be. And that's what the industry and the public were wondering. What will John Carpenter do next? So they weren't disappointed. The film was a great, great success. And, you know, in a sense, he cemented his legacy as a great filmmaker with Escape from New York and many other films afterwards. But I think it's that film that people return to. It's that film that he was perhaps at the height of his powers, and they were untethered powers, because something that your listeners might not know, Matt, I'm sure you will. Avco Embassy is not a major motion picture company. It's a great independent company, but it meant that there was not a stream of executives coming down, leaving notes for people, telling them what to do and how to do it. Dean Cundy said to me on the interview for this book, I've worked on many pictures since this, of course. He's worked with Steven Spielberg on Jurassic Park, on Bob Zemeckis for Back to the Future, Romancing the Stone. He said, you know, when I'm working with John Carpenter, it's a little family unit and we get on with things and nobody gives me notes. But he says, when I worked on other pictures, people give me notes. And I'm thinking, who could give Dean Cundy a note on lighting? I'd like to meet that person because imagine being caught scribbling something, you know, I think it's a bit too dark, or I could do it a bit brighter. Just the cheek of someone to write a note like that for Dean Cundy, let alone someone like John Carpenter. So after Escape from New York, it was studio pictures and some terrible experiences and things kind of unraveled, shall we say. But when John was left to get on with it and do what he wanted within his own expert team of people, then the results were pure gold. Yeah.
And I'm kind of always interested. You kind of touched on it there. It does seem like coming out of Hollywood right there in the mid late 70s, there was kind of a nucleus, kind of like, if I can say the word right, of filmmakers that then kind of, really exploded out from there. And we mentioned Nick Castle, who did the amazing The Last Starfighter, but also, like, if you're looking in the credits of Escape from New York, there, I believe it's a matte painting credit by somebody called Jim Cameron that might have gone on to do things in the film industry. Some people might have heard of his name. It just seems like there was a creative kind of group that was just surrounding John Carpenter and a few others that were really leading kind of the way out of Hollywood. Am I seeing that correctly?
Yes. So you have old Hollywood and new Hollywood. Yeah. Old Hollywood were people who were kind of saw it as a job. They were maybe contracted in the past to the studio. Now the studios were contracting people less and less. And under a contract, if you're a director, you'll be told, these are the scripts that we've bought, and you can choose one, and we can tell you what you're doing next week. And so it's much more of a production line process. Once that broke down in the 70s and it became project to project, then directors from the past felt less able or willing to fight for individual projects. Younger directors and people interested in cinema who didn't mind the conditions of working through the night or working 7 days a week were much more committed and dedicated. So you have a situation where James Cameron came on board to work with Roger Corman's company down at New World to do the special effects on Battle Beyond the Stars, which is a fabulous film from 1980, and had special effects that tried to rival Star Wars. And they really did. They were certainly of their time, and they were done on a much lower budget, but their scale and ambition certainly rivals Star Wars. And I think that's recently been restored in 4K as well. So it was because of the work that James Cameron and others did on that they were able to pitch for the special effects on Escape from New York. And, James Cameron is an example of a filmmaker who made things happen for himself. Mm-hmm. He wanted the vision of Terminator to be what it turned out to be. And he managed to achieve that. And consistently with his films, when we look at everything from, The Abyss to True Lies and the other Terminator film, and then Avatar and Titanic, these are films that are made on his completely under his auspices. He's totally in control of anything that works and anything that doesn't. I think studios took a while to get used to that, to someone who can't really be managed, because you shouldn't really manage someone like James Cameron. Mm-hmm. Again, what notes will you give James Cameron? Too many endoskeletons. I just can't imagine,
Yeah.
So it's studios who are concerned, and rightly so, by the financial bottom line, have sometimes horror stories about films that have gone massively over budget, and everyone at the studios then ended up being sacked. So, sometimes the money men are portrayed as these evil, terrible people who hate cinema, mm-hmm. but it really isn't the case. They're trying to protect it for everyone. And all it can take is one big project like Heaven's Gate to sink a studio. And, those stories are very real. As much as you hear those stories of people who've turned down Star Wars, there'll be people who've turned down Howard the Duck.
Yeah,
but you don't read about that in Variety or Hollywood Reporter, or if you do, it's a tiny little piece at the back. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously, there's so much there. I could derail the conversation just talking about that, but of course, we want to talk about Escape from New York and kind of picking up with special effects. And you mentioned that Escape from New York, $6 million. I know, obviously, to me personally, $6 million is a huge amount of money. But when you're talking about Hollywood movie budgets, nowadays, I mean, if you were to, one cast member of a Marvel movie makes 3 times, $6 million, right? To be in the movie. But Escape from New York really, with their special effects and just some of the way it was shot really pushed that budget and got the maximum amount out of that budget. I think the use of helicopters and some really wide shots really kind of got the use out of that budget and made it look like it was a much, higher budget film. Do you feel the same way? Oh, absolutely. A lot of it's to do with advances in technology. So if we think about trying to shoot this film in the mid 70s, to expose film in low light levels, you get lots of grain in the picture. Now, if you look back at an old film, a grain can look like lots of bees buzzing on screen, and so it's not something that's an artistic choice. It's a limitation of the technology. People used to say to me about Ray Harryhausen films, "Oh, I love the black and white ones. Why didn't he shoot lots more in black and white?" Ray didn't want to shoot in black and white. There was budgetary and technology reasons for that. So when you come kind of forward to the late 70s, there was a development in lighting. HMI lights were introduced. They were highly sort of efficient lights, and they gave out a much sort of brighter light. So you could use ultra fast lenses. And so ultra fast lens means that you can use less light to, as it were, craft the picture on film without having a very high level of noise or grain. And so Dean was talking to me about how the developments in HMI lighting really changed the whole look and feel of Escape from New York, because he used those lights very sparingly. And then within scenes, he would light fires and use those as practical lights. And some of the street lights are actually lit in the film as well. You can see that in different points, and it's not too jarring. But it's a very sparse, dark film, but of very high quality. So people who've seen the recent 4K remaster of it will be stunned. You think as if you could dip in and touch the picture, and it looks as if it was shot yesterday. So it really is an interesting look. But the framing as well, holding the frame, allowing not much to be going on in the frame to give that sense of barren emptiness and decay, which the streets of St. Louis provide for New York. That's quite incredible.
Yeah, and I think that is an important point. And just to remind, some of the listeners, if you go back to, older films, right? A lot of times they were shooting what was called day for night, right? They would shoot in the daytime, and then they would darken the image somehow. And when that is done well, it looks very interesting, but many times it's not done well. So being able to shoot at night is really like revolutionary, right? I mean, it's just really, as you were saying, it really changes the quality of what you can pull off, right? And
absolutely, and the unions will want to charge more because it's overtime. Once you go after 5 in the evening, and I'm not union bashing, so I'm not throwing shade on that. Not any Teamsters coming after me.
Oh no.
But it's the fact that when you're looking at a budget, you charge more if it's on the weekend or it's in the evening time and so on. Day for night is really tricky. We used to shoot that at film school because if you wanted to get a job as a lighting cameraman or cinematographer, knowing how to shoot day for night for TV is essential. Because on a television budget, you're never shooting at nighttime, not unless it's a big budget television. So the key for day for night is to shoot near trees and don't show too much sky, because the sky is a dead giveaway. And basically you close down the aperture to allow less light in. But when you get back to the lab and you have a look at it, you're thinking, it just looks a bit dark in the daytime. So you sometimes will add a bit of a blue tint to it, and maybe some kind of nighttime sounds. And that kind of gives the impression. But I think the most kind of prolific use of day for night are the Hammer horror films from the 1960s, where you can see virtually everything is shot at lunchtime. And, whether it's Dracula flying through on a horse and carriage or whatever, it's all in the daytime. And the day for nights in some of those don't work quite as well. But without those sequences, the way they were shot, we wouldn't have those films. So I don't think it was a case of people thinking, oh, don't bother. People won't know it's lunchtime. Just darken it in the lab. It's a necessity of budgets. But here they had the luxury of filmmakers who were prepared to work through the night. And a brilliant cinematographer, Dean Cundy, is lighting the shadows, as I called it in that chapter heading. So this book is full of chapters. There's a whole chapter for Dean Cundy. There's several chapters for the special effects guys. The woman who did the stills on it, Kim Golteb Walker, she was a groundbreaking unit stills photographer. Her work is just magnificent. And quite rightly, she gets her own chapter where I discuss how she works and what her working processes were. Because in the digital age now, things have changed quite a lot. But the way she worked and how she did that is revealed in the book pretty much for the first time, because actors and their stories seem to trump everything else. So if you're speaking to the stars of the new science fiction film, it's the lead, guy and the lead girl. And that's because most of the audiences are interested in that. Most people don't really want to know whether it was a real car they used or two cars cut together and so on. But those people who do want to know that are buying this book. A lot of people would say to me, once you've seen a film, why would you keep it? Because stream it. You don't need it taking up place in your house. And I'm like, this is the 4K. Yeah, but it's got a booklet with art cards and the soundtrack. It's like, who listens to that stuff? It's like, well, me. Yeah. Me, actually. I listen to it. If there's 1 or 2 minutes of extra music, I'll buy the whole thing again. I was speaking to Alan Howarth for this book as well about unused takes. And there is some stuff out there that hasn't yet been released on CD. And I'm right in there buying it. But it's for people like me, these books are written, because I would buy this book if I hadn't written it. And it's much easier to buy the book and read it than it is to write it. So tips for anyone out there who's thinking, I know I'm going to write this book. No, just read it. It's much easier. I would have in many ways preferred just to have read these books.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love all of this stuff too. And I feel pretty much the same way, that I love digging into seeing how some of these movies were made and some of the creative choices that were made. I just find it absolutely fascinating. And as we were talking, about Day for Night and some of those things, you will see some movies, where people are walking around with lanterns in the daytime, and it wasn't their fault, right? Like they were trying to do the best they could. I think the most infamous, or one of the most infamous, is The Creature from Crater Lake, I believe, where they thought they were going to be done in post-production, but they were not. So people are talking about the stars and it's bright day outside. But you did mention something else. You said the streets of St. Louis fill in for the streets of New York because a lot of the main action for Escape from New York was shot in the city of St. Louis. Interesting trivia for everybody who's listening. And I am sitting probably about 20 minutes away from most of the places where they shot those scenes. So I am very close here to St. St. and it is interesting that not many big budget movies are shot in the Midwest, let alone St. Louis. And it comes up when I do conventions, local conventions, and I talk about movies or I talk about role-playing games at local conventions. A lot of times it comes up that Escape from New York was shot in St. Louis because there are a lot of fans of that movie, and and everybody seems to be interested because it's kind of now part of the local history of St. Louis. But they did some really innovative things to make it look like you were in New York, but you are actually someplace else. Isn't that right?
Yes. So you have the opening of the film where you see Snake going over in the glider and he's approaching New York, and that's, of course, is a model shot. There is a sequence where you see the Statue of Liberty in daytime at the end. So there's enough sort of hints and suggestions, and of course a few iconic shots where it's a bit like when TV dramas in the UK can't afford to film in London. They'll have some shots of Buckingham Palace or Downing Street and so on, and then they'll go to a street in the north of England where it's just a regular kind of residential street. I think it helped enormously because the streets were so smashed up. It was very, very dark. Mm-hmm. So for most eyes, certainly for people from Europe, you could recognize it's an American street. But New Yorkers would probably go, nah, that's not New York. But, they didn't at the time because the film was very successful, and none of the reviews picked up on that. Mm-hmm. All of the reviews thought it did look like New York. And I think the style of architecture that they chose to shoot against did have a look at the New York projects in the case of where the Air Force One has crashed. And of course, if you're looking at the background, something's gone wrong. So where Air Force One has crash landed, and that's a real jet that they took apart for that sequence and set on fire, and they painted it the livery of President's plane. You're looking at Snake. The background is simply that. It's the backdrop from which he walks from place to place. And yes, they dressed it really well. They lit it really well, from the theatre to the library to the bridge itself for the finale. You didn't for a minute think you weren't in New York. And I defy most people who saw it at the time to really realize that wasn't New York. So I think it's, hats off to the filmmakers for producing something there, which is what films are all about, really, to create a fantasy world, but one that's quite a sort of dystopian future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right that, the combination of being filmed at night and being filmed in certain places in certain architecture in the background definitely make it blend in. And you couldn't be more correct when you say, if you are just constantly looking at the background, you're probably bored by the movie, right? Escape from New York just keeps you, hooked the whole time. And so that's usually the mark of a great film, that you, can come back later on, and on the 10th or 20th viewing go, oh, right, this thing wouldn't be correct for New York. But you're like, you just watched that movie 25 times to realize that, it wasn't the first time or the first few times that you watched that movie. You were still caught up in the story with that. And I think that is interesting. And of course, I'm sure there are many people out there who, like you were saying, with London or with Los Angeles, certainly would probably see movies and be like, oh, well, this is not, that's Los Angeles. That's not Salt Lake City or something like that, would happen like that. But I think, it is absolutely right with the idea that you just don't even think about that it's somewhere else, because the filmmakers have done such a good job framing it with that great shot of the Statue of Liberty, and then kind of a pan down into darkness, and then a pan over. And of course, you went from, the Statue of Liberty to, St. Louis. But now they were one of the few film crews, right, to get to shoot right next to the Statue of Liberty. Isn't that right?
That's right. It's rare for permission to be given at that time. Mm-hmm. Filming didn't really happen that much in New York in a way that's as organized and formalized as it was by the end of the 80s. Mm-hmm. So setting up a film office, probably New York was one of the first in the US to set up a film office, a native one. Mm-hmm. Of course, Woody Allen would shoot quite frequently in New York. But one that sprung to mind as you were talking there was the most egregious example, and I'm a big fan of Superman 3, so no one, I'm not throwing that much shade on it, is that the external shots for that were mostly filmed in Calgary, Alberta, mm-hmm. due to Canada's tax breaks. Mm-hmm. And so when Superman is flying around that city, that ain't New York. That ain't New York. I'm like, what's happening here? What happened? Did it get pressure washed or something? It's no, it's not New York. Yeah. Sorry about that. Anyone who's planning to watch Superman 3 with the supercomputer, which is probably less powerful than my iPhone.
Yes. Yes. There's also, this is totally a tangent, but I think it's the Jackie Chan movie Rumble in the Bronx.
Oh, yes.
Where you can see snow-capped mountains in the background, because I think they shot in Vancouver or someplace in Canada or something. And you're just like, wow. It's like, I don't know New York very well, but I don't think there are snow-capped mountains just like right behind it. But things like that happen, right? Things like that happen.
Yeah, it's what you do to make a film. It's if you can afford to shoot at night, choose at night. If you can afford to go to the cities you want to film in, but if you can't, don't be put off from making your film. I shot a film about the death of Henry VIII and took over a Jacobean manor house in South London, mm-hmm. and I needed the whole thing to be set at night because it all takes place during like one night. Mm-hmm. But we shot all of the daytime scenes in the day, but instead of shooting day for night inside the manor house, I had the entire outside of it covered off with black felt. So inside, effectively, it was night. Yeah. So you set everything to a 0 point and light from there. So we didn't allow any daylight through those windows. And the effect is really quite something. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like going to the cinema years ago in the 70s, certainly in Europe and in London. There was no lights in the cinema. Someone would have to show you to your seat with a torch. Mm-hmm. When the lights came up after the film and you went outside, you were like, my eyes, like you've been in prison for 10 years. So that doesn't happen often, but on a film, you can make that happen. If you think about it, you don't have to shoot at night to create nights. But I think, John Carpenter and the team here had 6 million. And for them, that was a king's ransom.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when you were, when you were digging into the book, I'm sure you found out some things that you did not know and that kind of surprised you. What are a couple of the things about Escape from New York that you were just kind of excited to learn about and kind of took you by surprise?
Almost everything. So there's things from the casting to the production side of things, because I'm a producer as well. I'm kind of interested in the mechanics and of course the FX. So I'll take the first one first. Avco Embassy, great company, they suggested for the lead for this picture Charles Bronson, Snake Plissken. And it's like when often I've told people, they laugh or they scoff and they think that would have been terrible. Charles Bronson was also suggested as the lead for The Omen that was ended up played by Gregory Peck. So Charles Bronson must have had some killer agents at the time because he's been put for all the right projects. It was mostly because of his success in Michael Winner's Death Wish that he was felt to be a good choice. And actually, he would have been a good choice. That's not throwing any disrespect to Kurt Russell, who's brilliant and outstanding in the role. But Charles Bronson would have brought his own personality to it. And in fact, one of the early posters that was never released, but it is in my book. Anything that's worth having is in my book in the poster section. There is a concept poster that was created with Charles Bronson in mind. So you have a kind of a Charles Bronson squatting down in front of barbed wire with a gun, and behind him the Twin Towers looking all shot to pieces. And this was a pre-release image that would often be put in the trade papers just to announce a film is starting and it's the new picture and so on, because film companies love crowing about that. They never take out adverts, do they? Say, oh, we lost so much money this weekend. We lost $300 million in this last month. You never see those ads in Variety, do you? But you do see the posters for advance productions. And so that was fascinating to know. Of course, John Carpenter wasn't keen to have a big star in that role because he felt it would unbalance the director-star relationship. And if we think back to the film Spartacus with Kirk Douglas, Douglas, who played the lead of Spartacus, the slave in that film, he had the director fired and replaced with Stanley Kubrick. So, you can imagine a situation, John Carpenter's got so much more money now, there's so much more responsibility. If he didn't get on with the star, who knows what would have gone wrong. But the studio were like, Kurt Russell, he's the former child actor who did sort of romantic roles and was last playing Elvis. Really? Him? And it's now we think of it, of course, Kurt Russell, because he's a very versatile actor. So as a kind of a compromise, a lot of the other cast, not to compromise, that's the wrong thing to say, but to give some assurity under the production, you have Lee Van Cleef, Ernest Borgnine, Donald Pleasance, Isaac Hayes, Harry Dean Stanton. So there's no question of the wonderful acting ability here. And the magnificent Adrienne Barbeau, who was married to John Carpenter at the time. She said to me that she'd turn up on set and would kind of have to pinch herself that John had put all this together. It was such a big budget film. It was proper movie making. It was really exciting for everyone involved. So that was a surprise. The other surprise was, and this is maybe not that interesting for some people who even read making of books, but Kim Goldteb Walker, who was the unit stills person and who's provided the majority of the pictures that are in my book, she ended up having to get the law changed so she could be the unit stills photographer in St. Louis on this picture, because various rules that were in place to protect workers' rights, which is quite right, would have meant they would have to have gone perhaps with someone local. And so the story of how she had that changed, and Deborah Hill, the producer of the film, who's worked with John Carpenter on many of his films, sadly, she's no longer with us. She was the champion for Kim and making sure that she was the unit stills person, because John Carpenter had worked with her on so many pictures before. He felt he wanted to keep the family together, rightly so. So that was interesting. And then in the FX, wow, the FX stories, there's more shots of the FX in this book than any other section, I think. But I'm kind of a little bit obsessed with all of that. When they had their initial pitch, they had the production drawings by Joe Alves, and they took them down to different special effects houses and looked at them. And John Dykstra, who created the effects for the first Star Wars film, he says, yep, we can do that. it'll cost $3 million to do all of these effects. And I'll need $1 million up front for myself because I'll direct all of these sequences. And of course, they couldn't afford that. They wanted John Dykstra, who wouldn't? But that just wasn't feasible for them. So they looked around, they went to other places, and it was Roger Corman's company who ended up getting the gig. And they ended up doing it for a shockingly low $350,000.
Wow.
But they were really innovative in what they did. And if we look now at the effects and look back and think, wow, these hold up really, really well. If you look at similar films from the early 80s where they did spend lots of money on motion control special effects, perhaps haven't aged as well. Think of films like Firefox. And I don't want to mention too many films in case they're booked. I end up I have to doff my cap to directors. I'm very sorry what I said in that podcast about Firefox, but please can I do this book? So the effects in the film work really well, and they are kind of smoke and mirrors the way they did it. And we break down every single shot, every single effect. And we have exclusive new photography from John Walsh, who's the designer behind the vector graphics. And that's all of the computer style effects that you see in the film, the readouts, the CGI cityscapes, all of that stuff. Because that was done by creating a model landscape in black. The edges of the building were taped with white tape. Then it was photographed. And then through photographic processes, they turned the white strips green to make it look like a computer vector readout. All of that is model work. None of that is real computer graphics because it couldn't be achieved at that time. So that was fascinating to break that properly down into how they did it and why they did it like that. And, it's fascinating because of the lower budgets. It meant they had to innovate. And it's often through innovation that these achievements are made. When I think back, because I'm a trustee of the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation, so I help look after the films, the restoration, and all the creatures and so on. Most of Ray's films were made very cheaply, and yet people don't think of them as that. So he had to innovate, do things on his own, mainly because there wasn't the money to employ other FX people to work with him. So, having a tighter budget sometimes makes you think in different ways, makes you think laterally. And that's why we get these sort of more interesting and oddball choices.
Yeah, and that is fascinating to learn that was model work instead of a computer screen, because I don't know, I think we're almost spoiled nowadays, right? I mean, we could do that with a free program on the internet or something, right? We could just create that very quickly. And it's just interesting to hear what they had to go through to create some of those shots. And I think you're absolutely right that the low budget sometimes forces people, and even I would say the restrictive medium of film itself forced people to innovate and to be more creative than they would have been if they could have just, kind of dashed something off on a free program online, which I'm sure there are many that you could do something like that with nowadays.
Well, the thing is, if somebody had said to filmmakers in the 80s, by the year 2020, you'll have high definition film and video camera as such in your pocket with a phone, they'd be thinking, oh, that must be the end of cinema then. Does anyone go to cinema? Is everyone making movies? Is there like 24 Alfred Hitchcocks in every continent? No.
Yeah.
So despite the fact we all have these cameras in our pockets, and as you say, we could do that graphic. You could make a graphic that looks, nobody has created a John Carpenter film on an iPhone yet. So, and there doesn't look likely to be anyone who's going to do that, because a lot of young people like to do videos which are short and engaging. They're the popular ones. The idea of doing something that's a lot of effort, that would take lots of people to film over several nights and weeks and so on. A lot of the old techniques are still used. So even though people are shooting in a digital environment and it's a digital workflow, if you were to look at the behind the scenes images on the big movies today, the Star Wars films, the Marvel films, there's even more people than there was on Flash Gordon or on Star Wars and the Star Trek movies originally from the 70s and 80s. So technology hasn't actually made the workforce go down or made things easier. If anything, it's made the process more complex and layered and involves even more persons, more feet on the ground. $100 million movie is no big deal now. It's virtually the price of a rom-com. Whereas with the first $100 million movie would have been headlines in the newspapers, how will this film ever make its money back?
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting. Technology hasn't answered the question of can anyone be a filmmaker? Because the answer to that's inside someone's head and not inside the technology that they're exposed to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because when I was playing around with filmmaking for the first time in some of the early 90s and mid 90s, I remember a quote from, I think it was Francis Ford Coppola, who was saying like the next Hitchcock or the next, somebody is going to, be like a 12-year-old girl in Ohio or something, right? Because everybody has video cameras and everybody has film, we can have access to it all, but you're absolutely right. That didn't really happen, right? Like we're missing, I don't know, sports might say the intangibles, right? We're missing something that you can't put your finger on very easily, right?
Well, look, I do lectures for young filmmakers now. I'm not old myself, but when I'm asked to go back to film school and speak to young students, they'll ask me, why were you successful? And is it because you're good at pitching? Well, that's part of it. Is it because you're a good filmmaker? That's part of it. There are elements to it, but there's one particular thing that you need to have. And of course, I float the question around the room and people pop their hands up and they say those things I just said, or say about having contacts or having a good camera and so on. And you exhaust the room. And when you tell them, the look of, well, I knew that anyway, that comes across their face. It's like, well, nobody said it. If you didn't say it, you weren't really thinking it in that moment. And maybe that's why it hasn't worked for you. And the single thing you need to have as a filmmaker to help distinguish you is to have something to say. So filmmakers who are consistently successful have something to say in their films. And even you might think, well, hang on, John Carpenter's Escape from New York is just a thriller. There's nothing to say in that. There is something to say. There's something to say about corruption at the very top of government. The film was written at the time of the Watergate scandal. There's something to say about incarceration. America had its highest number of people incarcerated by the late 70s. So the film is a commentary on both those things. And I think if you remove both of those elements from the story, then it falls flatter. So John Carpenter's films do have things to say. There is a momentum behind him as a filmmaker. He's not just thinking, I'll do this because it's a mix of these two genres. I think if you can think separately to market pressures, that really helps. Yeah. The last thing in the book to tell you about that's surprising and unusual and hasn't been seen before is in the poster section, where we have so many different posters from so many different artists. The original release poster, which isn't the one we know and love, is here by Stan Watts and in all of its glory. But the thing that's going to surprise people is Drew Struzan, who's the top of the hill when it comes to poster art, particularly from the 70s and 80s. He did Escape from New York work. And even though it wasn't on the original release version of it, and he went on to work with John Carpenter, of course, on The Thing and Big Trouble in Little China, he did wonderful artwork and it hasn't been seen before. And that's here in the book for the very first time as well. So we're very grateful to Drew and Dylan Struzan for allowing us access to those.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And, I want to respect your time. I could keep talking to you probably all day, John. So, but I do want to ask just, kind of quickly about Escape from New York. It was very influential among filmmakers, among creatives, and obviously among, film fans as well, right? And could you talk a little bit about some kind of the influences that kind of rippled out from Escape from New York?
I suppose the most obvious one that people often think about when you look at the poster of the decapitated Statue of Liberty on the release picture, mm-hmm. That was Barry E. Jackson's wonderful artwork, and Barry spoke to me for the book about it. That appears in Cloverfield, almost at the same angle on what's a slight Dutch tilt on the streets. And J.J. Abrams is said, and it was Adrian Barbeau who repeated this story to me again, and I'd heard it before, that J.J. Abrams, when he was a young man, his father was an executive at a studio, and he got to see a test screening of Escape from New York, and he really loved the picture. Mm-hmm. And apparently it was a comment, whether this is true or not, it's what Adrian told me. It was a comment that JJ had made that meant they went back and inserted a shot in Maggie's death scene on the bridge, because it wasn't altogether clear that she had died in that confrontation with the Duke of New York. Mm-hmm. So they went back in and they put an insert scene in of Maggie kind of eyes open but covered in blood underneath that particular brand of car, whichever it was. So there's an example. But J.J. Abrams, people know him now for Star Trek and Star Wars and Cloverfield, of course. So there's a filmmaker who people say has been influenced by this. But lots of films have been influenced by the dystopian future. Mad Max, Blade Runner, and Escape from New York all happened within a couple of years of each other. Mm-hmm. And that slightly or completely redrew the future. So 1997 wasn't going to be a glass-domed Logan's Run future where everyone was in pristine outfits, rather disappointingly. But it was actually going to be quite grubby, where no one looked like they washed their hands, and which is quite disturbing to many people. So that alternative future where things get a lot worse. It was hinted on with Soylent Green in the 70s, which is a great film with Charlton Heston. But filmmakers never really had great success with it. People want to see the future as gleaming and sparkling. And of course, Star Wars in 77 showed it could be used in secondhand. But here it was seen to be adult and dangerous. And look, the prisoners have taken over. You know, if you think of New York as much as it's a maximum security prison, within New York itself, those people have taken charge. And so there's different commentary at the time and now, and talk about what that means today about the population and, you know, right-wing governments. And so I think the ripple, the effects, this book, the fact we're talking about it 40 years on, think about the other films that came out that year. Clash of the Titans, The Great Muppet Caper, Dragon Slayer, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was John Carpenter's Escape from New York that went to 4K about 2 or 3 years ago. We've had to wait until this year to get Raiders in 4K. Clash of the Titans still not in 4K. Dragon Slayer not even in 2K on Blu-ray. What's going on, Paramount and Disney? Sort that out. And The Great Muppet Caper, which is the best of the Muppet films, is on Disney Plus, but it's not looking its very best. You know, it's Escape from New York that perhaps is the shining jewel, and Clash of the Titans, of that period. So it's stood the test of time, and it's really outlived the critics who didn't like it. You know, I came across negative reviews, as you do in research, and some of them seem grossly ignorant when we look back with our 2021 eyes. But that was 1981. You know, the whole process of trying to get the film nominated for an Academy Award for special effects was incredibly difficult. Yeah. Because other people in the special effects chapter looked down at Roger Corman's New World company. And I mean, that's crazy to think that. They were innovative. They did something that was wonderful. Surely that should be celebrated. But no, film people ain't that nice. Newsflash.
Yeah. Just an aside, I think I heard just the other day that Tron didn't qualify for Academy Award special effects because computers were used.
This was similar to do with music as well. Alan Howarth said that Tron was never nominated because it was computers. It wasn't considered real music by the Musicians Union. Yeah, I dare say that's true. The funny thing about Tron, it's only got is it 7 or 8 minutes of computer FX? Everything else is composites. Yeah, and beautifully done. Again, someone write that book, and if you don't, I will. That's a great film. I love Tron. When I saw it and heard that it hadn't succeeded, I was thinking, there isn't another film called Tron that's really bad, because this one's really good. How could this one have failed? It's such a good film, Tron. I think it's a great companion piece for Escape from New York, because it's so opposite in many ways. And it's a great example of people never knew when they were being served something wonderful. I'd like to go back and slap a few of those people from 1981 who they came out of the cinema and thought, I didn't like that. I want to go and see Herbie Goes Bananas instead. It's like, what are you thinking? Get back in and watch it again.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were treated to some great movies there in the early 80s. But as you were mentioning, again, I don't want to keep you too long, but you were mentioning some about like the kind of the post-apocalyptic feel. And there were some before this in the mid 70s. They're usually films that, you know, that are niche films people haven't heard about, say a Boy and His Dog, that a lot of people haven't heard about, or Death Race 2000, that influenced the making of, Mad Max. But then once you were kind of right when you were saying, it's just like Mad Max 2, or The Road Warrior as it's known here in the States, and then Escape from New York, all in that 79 to like 81. And of course, then you get, Blade Runner in 82, but also like Escape from New York inspired a lot of, I guess you would kindly say, rip-off movies, just like Road Warrior and the Mad Max movies did. And I was wondering if that's possible because, not every place in the world has, Broken Hill, Australia, where you can shoot, a 50-mile flat desert. So, but you have buildings and you can throw trash around buildings and kind of, make that look like an urban area. And I just thought that was interesting because Escape from New York then inspired a number of imitators, didn't it?
It did, but none of those films are really remembered.
Yeah,
and I think a great
absolutely.
one from the 70s that isn't remembered is Damnation Alley with George Peppard. It's a great score by Jerry Goldsmith. I think the real measure for longevity is if something has been given a 2 or 4K restoration, because a lot of the studios have major titles that had the major stars of the day, whether it's sort of William Holden or Cary Grant and so on, and not all of those films have been fully restored because people aren't interested once the star has faded. And those they are great actors who've appeared in great films, but people are less interested in stars. They're more interested in the films they remember and that they remembered remembering. You said that after Escape from New York, you thought about it a lot, and years later you were still thinking. Yeah. So I think the test of longevity is if we look back after 30, 40 years and we're still thinking about the film and we'll pay for it again. I mean, how many times have I got to pay for Escape from New York? I did the VHS, I did the VHS widescreen, I did the DVD, I did the Blu-ray, I did the 4K. If they inject it into my brain, that'll be the 6th version of it. So who knows? And I'll be the first in the queue. I'll be like right here in the forehead, just inject it straight in.
Yes, the 360 environment or whatever we're going to have in the future, right?
That'd be amazing. You probably need a brain implant for that, but I'm prepared to take the risk.
yeah. For certain movies, it'd be worth the risk. Yeah, absolutely. I just. I don't know. And I think you were absolutely right when you said that the filmmaker has to have something to say, and you were right again when hiring a certain level of superstar actor or something that could where, let's be frank, like ego or something could get into the in the way, because like you don't even necessarily like have to agree with some of the things that are in some of the things that John Carpenter had to say necessarily. It is just so powerful, and somebody is speaking about it, it just resonates. And I think that is a key thing, because you can anybody with a video camera can shoot somebody chasing somebody down the street, but what are you saying? Or a dinner scene where people are talking, but like, what are you saying as a filmmaker? I think that is an incredible point.
And you have two audiences. You have people who will watch a film and enjoy it, and that's great. Mm-hmm. They won't want to read a book about it. Yeah. They're like, I don't want to read. It's like being back at school. I've got to read a book. You don't have to read a book. I've written the book. You don't have to read it. Okay. Because how many pages is it? It's 200 pages about a film. How did you manage to? It's like, you don't have to read it. Not yet anyway. No one's got a gun to your head. You never know in the future what could happen. But, those people who just watch the film and forget it, this isn't necessarily the book for them. But for people like you and I, Matt, who've watched the film and want to know more, I want to revisit it, then the book's for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And as people are listening to this, the book has just dropped yesterday. So, John, why don't you tell us where people can find your new book about Escape from New York?
Well, you can find it everywhere. It's on Amazon, in every Amazon territory, and you can get it on TysonBooks.com as well. There'll be a certain amount of signed ones that I will have done as well, I think mostly through Tyson Books and ForbiddenPlanet.com. And if you see me and you have my books, I will always sign them. So even if it's in a restaurant, I don't mind being disturbed. So if you've got that book, Flash Gordon, The Official Story of the Film, or Harryhausen, The Lost Movies, give me a tap on the shoulder and say, I heard you on Dice Geeks. You said you'd sign. So yes, that's no problem. And there's a vodcast we're doing as well, which is a video podcast, which expands interviews we had with other folks that we couldn't necessarily get into the book. And you can find that on YouTube. And if you search Escape from New York, The Official Story of the Film vodcast, very long title, but you'll find it there.
All right. And I will be sure to put links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now, if you just head over to dicegeeks.com, you will be able to find the show notes and you will see links to the book. And I will try to get the link to the YouTube channel as well. So everybody can find out more. Well, John, it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Like I said, I could keep talking to you all day about these movies. If you write the book about Tron, or you write the book about, I don't know, Blade Runner or The Last Starfighter, I am there. And I will have all of these in my library. So I really appreciate you coming back to the podcast, and I really appreciate all the work that you do. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Matt, and hopefully I'll see you next time.
All right, there you have it, guys. Oh my goodness. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with John today. I had such a great time discussing Escape from New York and other filmmaking trivia, I guess you would call it, with John. It is always a pleasure to have him on the show, and I am grateful for his time. Now, it is imperative that you check out his book, Escape from New York, The Official Story of the Film. At the initial release of this podcast, his book just debuted yesterday. That would be November 23rd of 2021. So please head over to dicegeeks.com right now. You will find links where you can buy the book, as well as learn more about John through his Twitter and other social media. So please, 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 I urge you to head over to the show notes at dicegeeks.com. Check out the book. You will not be disappointed. If you are a fan of science fiction, if you are a fan of cinema, if you are a fan of John Carpenter, if you are a fan of 80s movies, you will enjoy this book. So please, please check it out. Again, links in the show notes at dicegeeks.com. Also, it was really awesome to have John back on. He was the first guest on my podcast, and I could not be more thankful that he was willing to come back on and discuss his new book. He is a wealth of knowledge about film and cinema history, and I love tapping into his knowledge so that we can learn more about telling stories, because that is what this is all about. How can we learn from great storytellers, and how we can take all of that information and what we've learned and apply it into our role-playing games so that we can be better game masters and better role players. All right, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show, and each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on here in the world of Dice Geeks. Also, guys, if you want to support the show financially, you can do so on patreon.com/dicegeeks. I have goals. I have different tiers. Just for $1 a month or something like that, you can support the podcast. All of my patrons are awesome, and I love them, and they are so cool. I would love you to join them. Thank you so much for listening, and until next Wednesday, keep gaming.